Fossils are very interesting artifacts. I work among fossils. In fact, I've had the privilege of being the director of a team, and together we have discovered and excavated over 16, I say over 16 because we have various fragments, over 16 dinosaurs from the Biloxi River all the way to northwestern Colorado. And fossils are very intriguing. Now, they're of major significance. Most fossils are just rocks. They are rocks that bear the image of a once living organism. However, some fossils bear some of the actual carbon from the original organism. Let's begin the story today by referring to a biblical passage late in the earthly ministry of Jesus, the Son of God. As he left Bethany and passed the brook and valley Kidron, a little donkey had been prepared, and they sat Jesus on the donkey. And as he sat and approached the wall of the eastern gate, people began to throw palm branches down, and they began to sing and shout, "Hosanna! Blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord." They knew by his power in raising the dead. They knew by his incredible message. They knew by the prophetic fulfillment that he was the Messiah, and they were ready to crown him king. God had other plans in the providence that would involve our salvation, but at that moment they were singing to the tops of their voices. But the Pharisees didn't like it. So they said to Jesus and the disciples, "Make all of your followers quieten down a bit. They're making too much noise. They're rousing the city." And Jesus said, "If these should hold their peace, the very stones would cry out." That's the topic of our discussion today. These stones cry out. These stones have an incredible message. In fact, back to what Jesus said about the stones crying out. Literally, can stones cry out? It's been discovered scientifically that when you speak or there is an action with percussive energy adjacent to a stone, there's a molecular shift that actually records that message. However, once a new voice is heard or a new disturbance percussively is brushed over that chemistry, it erases the first or distorts the first. So we don't have a mechanism to play it back. But Jesus always tells the truth, always. And he said, these stones have the capability of crying out. Fossils have that kind of capability for us. They give an incredible message. I'm standing adjacent to what has been recently completed here at the Creation Evidence Museum. After more than 40 years of research and a year and a half of working with a graphics expert, then 15 and a half months with some very qualified master craftsmen, we now have a 1/20th scale model of Noah's Ark, 25 feet long, and it's built with the engineering technique that we're convinced God shared with Noah for him to use in building the original ark. It's called the gopher technique, where everything is structurally interlaminated together and becomes one. The word gopher means to house in. Thus, the ark, in everything in the ark, all of the structure was housed together for strength and durability in the storm. But those who missed the boat, those who were in the storm, became fossilized. And these fossils tell a story, a marvelous story. They answer a lot of questions if we line them up appropriately. Most of these fossils found their origin during the worldwide flood while Noah's Ark was afloat. In the sedimentary deposits, every 12 hours, Professor M.E. Clark of the University of Illinois, the late Professor M.E. Clark, one of our primary consultants, and his associate, Dr. Henry Voss, both professors at the University of Illinois, the main Urbana campus, demonstrated that the effect of the moon gravitationally on the waters of the flood that were filled with sediments that had been expunged from inside the earth. I'm trying to answer, where did we get the fossils? Where did they come from? The effect of the moon on this global body of water, taking this magmatic emulsified material, would lay it down in sheets every 12 hours. As the moon passed over, its gravitational attraction would lay down sheets of mud. In that mud would be encapsulated living material, once living material, some of it now dead during the violence of the flood, some of it encapsulated to die by suffocation and starvation inside that encapsulated material, those sedimentary layers. Some of these layers, such as the Austin Chalk Cretaceous layer, extend and belt the entire globe. Others, like the Morrison Formation, cover over 11 states in the United States and extend into Canada, covering vast areas of our globe in vast sheets of sedimentation. So the fossils, the living material that missed the boat, were entombed in this material and thus became fossilized. Now, in order for them to become fossilized, they had to be totally encapsulated. If they're not totally encapsulated in these sheets of magmatic material, this mud that quickly hardened like calcareous material, concrete, which is actually calcium carbonate, you mix it, and in a matter of hours or days, it hardens into stone or rock again. You get it from rock to begin with, you pulverize it, add a little material, and then you mix water, and again you have rock. Whatever is encapsulated in it is encapsulated permanently. So it was in the worldwide flood of Noah's day. The material, the living creatures that were caught in these sediments were entombed. If they were entombed, they were protected from oxygen, so their form remains. That's very significant. If they're left on the surface and they die in the tumult, scavengers destroy them, from bacteria to flying scavengers to swimming scavengers to oxygen scavenging them. And if they're on the surface and not encapsulated, they're not fossilized. How do we get fossils? Once living specimens have to be encapsulated. So, there's another significance to this. In Joshua chapter 4, we have a marvelous, marvelous story of Moses passing on. God took him away. Joshua led the children of Israel across the swollen Jordan. It was held up in heaps, backed up for a long, long distance, and Joshua led the priest, the warriors, and the people over dry shod. Once they got on the other side, Joshua said under inspiration of the Lord, each of you 12 leaders of the tribes, take a stone, take it to where you're staying. Well, later he had them put these in the Gilgal. The word Gilgal indicates the form of a shoe, because God had promised wherever the shoes of their feet would touch, that land they could claim. Dr. Adam Zertal, a personal friend of mine, discovered the real Gilgal within walking distance, within a few hours distance from the Jordan River. And there's a heap of stones still there today. Whether they're the original stones, we don't know. But then Joshua explained to the people, when your children grow up, they'll ask, what meaneth these stones? What's this heap of stones? What's the significance? Do these stones tell a story? And then they would have to explain, yes, the children of Israel, under God's providence and providential protection, passed over on dry shod as a miracle occurred in abating the waters of the swollen Jordan. So these stones have a story to tell. What is their story? Well, let's start with this rock. This is actual rock. Now, in the past, we were first taught that for rock to form, we were taught this a few decades ago, for something to be petrified, mineralized, as rock is, as this rock and fossil is, for it to be mineralized, it takes hundreds of thousands of years. And then they changed the story, and they said it takes tens of thousands of years. And then they said, well, it takes thousands of years. We now know that cedar posts have been planted in the soil for a fence. If the conditions were right with a flow of water and minerals underneath, it's called osmosis, where water flows and minerals replace that which is biodegraded with the flowing water. When this occurs, they've discovered that a cedar post under those conditions can actually fossilize, mineralize, petrify in 10 years. But let's go beyond that. I have a fossil rose. This rose is solid rock. It's mineral. It came from Europe at a special well, a well that has a system of the water flowing gently and the water filled with minerals. They found that if they take a rose, just pluck it, twist the stem, hang it down in the water, in 3 weeks, all of the living material is replaced and the rose has its perfect form, and in 3 weeks, this becomes solid rock. A fossil does not require long periods of time for its existence to be realized. This is a beautiful illustration. During the worldwide flood of Noah's day, these sedimentary layers, as I've explained, were formed because of the gravitational attraction of the moon on this global body of water, encapsulating living material and material that was alive until the tumult destroyed it, killed it. Under these conditions, the sediments replaced the cells that were biodegrading. According to standard evolutionary explanation, it took from 26,000 to 2 million years to produce that layer of limestone, very slowly. But according to the creation concept, using the work of Professor M.E. Clark, as the waters of the worldwide flood were building up, they had not yet covered the globe, but were building up, the effect of the moon bringing those waters into resonance, and with its gravitational effect, would cause a tidal bulge on both sides of the globe simultaneously. As the waters were ascending on a global scale, we have evidence around all 3 of those arches. In the state of Texas, the dinosaur tracks are around those arches. So those arches were apparently refuge areas. So as the tidal bulge brought in a new layer of material and then swept on over, then those who had been fortunate enough to be in refuge could come back and forage for food. So we're finding their tracks on layer after layer. To show that this is not an accumulation of hundreds of thousands or millions of years, and to show that it's essentially an overnight epoch, here we have a worm burrow. That is the refuse left as the worm burrowed through the material. And all of it was pliable enough for him to burrow in. This is made of calcium carbonate. That's what you make concrete of. M.E. Clark is the specialist, showing that in a matter of days, this would have cured. There would have been no way for him to burrow through concrete. But he was burrowing overnight, and he's not burrowing horizontally, Doyle. The importance of your discovery is that it's vertical. All of that was pliable. So this turns out to be quite significant in demonstrating that this is an overnight epoch. Yesterday I mentioned the clam burrows. If a clam was under the surface, that lithified so fast he couldn't work out, but if he was on the surface, there's a burrow mark. The clam has a little foot, and he burrows like that. And even that burrow mark cured so fast that it preserved. There's another one right here. Now,
If that required another one over there, if that required long periods of time, that would level out and smooth out. But it cured so fast, it's like a cat or a dog walking across freshly laid concrete, and it preserves.
Clams and other bivalve shellfish, called polysopods, are found in great abundance in fresh and salt water. At the beach, where waves wash in, sand and shellfish are deposited on the beach surface. Shellfish immediately begin to burrow down into the wet sand. If you pick up handfuls of wet sand after a big wave, you can sometimes feel small shellfish burrowing down, even to the point of trying to squeeze between your fingers. What happens when a clam dies? A clam is mostly two durable shells, a connecting ligament that also acts as a spring to open the shell halves, a foot that it can extend outside the shell for burrowing, and a powerful muscle to close the shell halves. At death, this muscle relaxes and the shell halves spring open. There's usually a hungry animal close by to eat the shellfish, leaving the shell halves connected and lying open. This is what we see in large numbers on beaches and creek banks. Even if the shellfish dies in thick mud and is somehow held closed, normal sand and soil movement soon separates the shell halves. However, in many deposits of limestone, vast numbers of fossil polysopods are found tightly closed. This can only happen during a catastrophic event that buries the shellfish in sediment that hardens quickly enough to prevent the shells from separating.
This is a special fossil. This came from our dig site in Colorado, where we've excavated 15 of the dinosaurs that we've discovered. And this is a huge tree. This is just a small limb of a huge tree. It's an Araucaria pine. Araucaria pine grows round, yet this entire tree, flattened, is compressed to an oval shape because at least 20 layers above it have pressed in upon it while it was still pliable. These layers, the Morrison Formation, extend for 11 states and into Canada. Hundreds and hundreds, thousands of square miles, in fact. And that weight bearing down while this was still pliable. All of that occurred in a very short span of time. We call this a polystrate fossil. Polystrate fossils are those that run from one layer to another layer to another layer. At the Creation Evidence Museum, we have the replication of a lepidodendron near Cookeville, Tennessee, where there's a forest of these club mosses growing like this, while layers encapsulate them, layers of rock and coal encapsulate them. According to evolutionary theory, it took from 2 to 5 million years for these layers to form. How on earth could that lepidodendron club moss, a big one, remain in place for even a year or a few months while the sedimentary materials were washing and moving and flowing around it? Impossible. All of this occurred very rapidly. In fact, this, as I said, is a special fossil. This Araucaria pine has the totally mineralized material, its rock, replacing the original material. Yet, there are seams within this and limbs off this that are simply coalified. The actual carbon is still in place. And then on the surface of some of it is the actual fibrous bark. In this one fossil, we have three forms. We have the permineralized material, the material that is turned to stone, the petrified material. Then, in some areas, we have the compression so dense and the heating so well that it turns some of that organic material into actual coal. But on the surface, we have some of the fibrous material still intact. I'm saying that all of this occurred rapidly during a worldwide flood. It did not take thousands of years for this to form. This fossil has the shell of a dinosaur, Tarbosaurus bataar, cousin to T-Rex. These are two eggs, and we have the carbonized material and rough surface of the egg itself. Many fossils are carbonized material. The original carbon has turned to coal because of the heat and the compression. So here we have a formation of fossils because of the flow of water, minerals replacing the biodegrading material. Here we have a fossil where tremendous heat has been generated under pressure, turning this shell into coal, even though it is still the carbon itself. Then we have other types of fossils. This is a very interesting fossil called a concretion. I've seen thousands of concretions. I dig dinosaurs and I work in the fossil record. What is the fossil record? The fossil record consists of the remains of once living material laid down in sedimentary deposits. According to evolutionary theory, those first layers were laid down hundreds of millions of years ago, like the Cambrian, like 600 million years ago. Yet, in the Cambrian was found a human sandal print. And according to evolutionary theory, man capable of making a sandal did not find his existence until just a few tens of thousands of years ago. So evolution is bankrupt when you really look at the details. But there is in this fossil record, in the sedimentary deposits, there is a general tendency for organisms that dwelt in the sea to be there, for organisms that were only semi-mobile to be next, for organisms that might be able to crawl out to be next, for organisms that were reflected, such as the mammals, to be ultimate at the top. But there's a logical reason for that. The reason is simply this. When the flood occurred, organisms that dwelt in the sea were caught where they lived. So they were entombed there. When the flood occurred with these sedimentary deposits, those that could move about and scurry to land were ultimately caught in the process of trying to get away from the tumultuous waters. Those that could live on land or sea were caught, and then finally those that were reflective enough to generate rafts or to climb onto floating limbs would be caught last. So it would be logical that these would be entombed in that order. But the significance is that throughout the geologic column, there's evidence that man was there, which destroys any evolutionary interpretation, and all of these are sandwiched together by polystrate fossils, meaning from one layer to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. It is one long series of tumultuous waters we call the worldwide flood. Well, if there was a worldwide flood, and man was alive when the flood first started about 5,000 years ago, why don't we find more human fossils? Well, that's a good question. It's been approximated that of all the fossils found that evolutionists would point to, jawbones and partial skeletons in various situations, there are probably no more than 4,000 of these that have been found by evolutionists and creationists combined. Why don't we find more human fossils? There's a logical reason for that. There was a flood. In a flood, when a human being dies, his body bloats because of its chemistry, and it floats. It's rare to be entombed in the sedimentary deposits. His body bloats and floats. And in the process, it's scavenged, first by the birds and the fishes and the wildlife. And what they don't get, bacteria devour. So you find almost nothing. Maybe a jawbone, maybe a tooth here or there, because those are the hardest components of the human body. In fact, the teeth are actual fossils while we live. So that's one reason we find teeth more readily. So human fossils are not found, or rarely found, in the fossil record. But let's talk about some more fossils. Back to this concretion. Often people come to me saying, I found a dinosaur egg, and they have a concretion. This is a concretion. This is actually the most beautiful concretion I personally have ever seen. A concretion is a series of shells concentrically formed around an original fossil. If you look at a little rock that's a concretion, or a big rock like this, looks like a bowling ball. You go to the bottom and you will find an organism. Here, the organism was a tiny little living creature. That little creature died or was caught in the flood. It began to roll, to move in the waters of the flood. That attracted more clay, so he became a clay ball. And then there was additional sediment that came. Rolling more, it became a ball of calcium carbonate. And then rolling more, different balls, you find 8 or 10 different circles or rings, all because it was rolling in moving water. The flood was tumultuous, and it sloshed back and forth, and each time a new concentric ring was formed, until ultimately you have this huge concretion, but it began with that little organism that got caught in a clay ball formed around it. Then there are other forms. This is what's called an ignites. And that's a special term for a trace fossil. These are actually little dinosaur prints, the smallest dinosaur prints ever found. Tiny little dinosaur prints. And this was found in New Hampshire. Ignites is a trace fossil. There's nothing left but an imprint. That's all that's there. None of the original material has been petrified. None of the original material has been coalified. There's just an imprint. That's an ignites. And then we come to a totally replaced fossil. Some fossils, like this equine tooth, and it's difficult to tell the difference between a camel's tooth and a horse's tooth because they're in the same general classification. So this horse tooth, this equine tooth, has been totally mineralized, totally replaced. Not simply by the adjacent rock, but replaced by harder material, and the original carbon remained in place, so this actually becomes a polished gem, completely replaced, not petrified, completely replaced with adjacent material adhering to the carbon of the original organism. And then, finally, we come to this very delicate fossil. This was found in formation in Colorado, the Green River Formation, and it's assigned an age of 50 million years. Not so. These are simply layers formed during the worldwide flood. These are actual bird feathers that were impacted so quickly and encapsulated so quickly that organisms such as bacteria and other scavengers couldn't affect them at all. And you see the barbules of the bird feathers in place. So to sum it all up, fossils are once living organisms that got caught in a flood and were encapsulated. We can make fossils. It doesn't take that long to make fossils. Actually, we have a little cylinder. In that cylinder, we put organic material, half-eaten hamburgers, potato vines, a half-eaten pizza. I'm sorry. There's no half-eaten pizza. It's all eaten. We put in that little cylinder organic material, half-eaten hamburgers, potato vines, whatever, chicken bones. And then we sprinkle a bit of clay as a catalyst. We add water. And then we put the cylinder on top. And then there's an arm, and we put a weight that generates heat. And if we want to really symbolize vast layers of rock that's formed above that, then we add heat to the bottom in the form of a burner. Do you realize what we're doing is simulating the conditions of the flood? Organic material that missed the boat, didn't go on the ark. And then you have clay, lots of clay around from the first week of creation, third day of creation. And then we add water, lots of water around from the fountains of the great deep and the seas from before the flood. And then we add pressure, which generates heat. How long do you think it takes us to generate coal under these conditions? 1 hour. In 1 hour, we can generate a fossil under these flood conditions. These conditions simulate the worldwide flood. And no wonder Jesus said, if these children should hold their peace, if you and I should cease to tell the story, the stones themselves would cry out if we just knew how to interpret them. I hope today this little discourse has encouraged you to behave like those recorded in Joshua chapter 4. And that is, our posterity comes along and they ask, what's the meaning of these stones? We tell them that they symbolize an act of God where He judged a world because of its violence and its wickedness. Yet He lovingly rescued those who were ready to respond to Him. In the person of His Son, Jesus Christ, He is ready now, if you will but open your heart's door and ask Him in. All it takes is to say, Lord Jesus, come in. I accept You as my Savior, and I'll serve You with all my heart. If you do that, every day you need to talk to God in prayer. Number 2, you need to let God talk to you by reading His Word. Number 3, you need to talk to someone else, mentioning the name of Jesus. There's power in His name. But you might say, well, I'm not qualified to go out and discuss theological dissertations. You don't need to start like that. Just begin by saying to your children, children, do you know Jesus really lived? Just using the name Jesus has power. It'll bring peace and power to your life. It's been a pleasure to speak with you today, and actually, these stones do cry out.